Nearly everywhere you look these days, another road, another bridge, another railway, another sports stadium is going up somewhere in Africa, all built by China. Beijing has been financing massive infrastructure projects in sub-Saharan Africa in recent years. We want to show you just some of the most prominent projects. We're going to pull up a graphic here for you. The Ethiopia-Djibouti Railway, the first electrified cross-border rail system in Africa. Kenya's multi-billion-dollar standard gauge railway that connects the capital Nairobi to the port city of Mombasa. In Uganda, the massive controversial Kampala-Entebbe Expressway. Cote d'Ivoire's Subre hydropower plant and Cameroon's Kribi deep sea port, the biggest and only deep water port in Central Africa. And of course, the list goes on. Last year, China surpassed the US as Africa's largest trading partner. So what does US investment in Africa look like at the moment? Joining us via Skype from Davis, California is Grant Harris. He's the CEO of Harris Africa Partners. Grant, hello there. Tell us, China's presence obviously is very ubiquitous on the continent. What is America building in Africa these days?
Thank you for having me on. America's still got a very strong and significant investment presence, but I think what you hear from many commentators is that it's just not where it needs to be. And there's been some steps taken, particularly under the Obama administration. It's a little unclear what the Trump administration's policies will be, but some of the early signs are pretty worrying in terms of de-emphasizing a push for promoting U.S. investment across the continent and really rolling back some of the trade efforts. But I think there's a lot of headroom at the end of the day. Some U.S. investors are quite serious, but we're not seeing them in the numbers that we need to.
So we've always talked about the race between China and the US for investment primacy in Africa. What is the status of that race? Is it on? Is it off? Is it over?
I think a lot of people like to characterize it as a race for some sort of supremacy, but I don't think it's really like that. There's some places where there is competition for sure, but at the bottom line is that many African states really need this capital and aren't going to care from which end of the globe it comes. That said, I'd really like to see more American companies taking a serious stake and increasing their exposure. And I do think that there are differences in how the investments occur. You mentioned some really important signature projects by China, but for the most part, there isn't a lot of transparency about Chinese financing, and they tend to be pretty opaque deals. And we've seen more and more concerns about African governments that are very highly indebted to China. About 14% of bilateral debt for sub-Saharan African countries, when you take out South Africa, is owed to China. And I think that there will be a very high cost for that.
Very briefly, Grant, what is the investment landscape like right now? Do you actually have to build something in an African country in order to build trust or a meaningful relationship?
I think relationships are much deeper than that. And that's one thing that the United States has in terms of decades of deep relationships, in terms of cultural ties, educational investments, investments in health, for instance, in combating HIV and malaria. But the relationships are really multifaceted. And China is not just making an economic play. It's also deepening its military relationships and its arms sales. It's deepening its cultural exchanges as well. And so the United States has a lot of very long-standing relationships to build on. But if the U.S. starts to retrench or starts to neglect the continent, I think those relationships are going to fray or really be weakened.
Grant Harris, thank you so much for your insights. It will be really interesting to see where all this goes in the next few years or so. Grant Harris, the CEO of Harris Africa Partners, speaking to us from Davis, California.